The night was thick with tension, like the charged air before a storm. Nathan couldn't help but feel it as he stepped into the vast ballroom, the grand event hall buzzing with quiet conversation and clinking glasses. It was the first official summit between humans and the Thraxi, an alien species that had only recently made contact with Earth. The importance of the night was undeniable. Every major world government had sent representatives, and the Thraxi had reciprocated, sending their most distinguished envoys. Nathan, a scientist by trade, wasn't accustomed to these diplomatic events. His specialty was biology, human and otherwise. He had been pulled in last minute to act as an advisor, an observer of sorts, to study how the Thraxi and humans interacted now that communication had been established. His work had primarily been in sterile laboratories, not in bustling, high-stakes social gatherings like this. He adjusted the collar of his suit, already uncomfortable in the stiff fabric. The room was grand gold accents on marble columns, massive chandeliers dripping with crystals, and towering windows that offered views of the city lights sparkling beneath the night sky. It was a strange juxtaposition, the old-world opulence of Earth's finest architecture playing host to creatures from beyond the stars. The Thraxi themselves were striking. Taller than most humans, with slender, athletic builds and skin tones that ranged from pale gold to deep crimson. Their features were angular, with sharp cheekbones, elongated eyes, and a slight iridescent shimmer to their skin, as if they were always catching some invisible light. They moved with a grace that bordered on predatory, and Nathan had already heard whispers among the human delegates about how unsettling that air of quiet dominance could be. He watched from the edges of the room, preferring to stay on the outskirts, his eyes taking in the scene as he sipped from his glass of water. Conversations swirled around him, discussions of trade agreements, technology exchanges, and the unspoken power dynamics that were always present when two very different species tried to negotiate peace. A soft laugh from across the room caught his attention. Nathan turned, his gaze settling on a figure that stood out even among the dazzling Thraxi delegation. She was taller than the others, her skin a deep, vibrant shade of red that was impossible to ignore. Her hair was long and black, cascading down her back like a waterfall of ink, and her eyes, bright gold, glowing faintly in the low light, seemed to shimmer as they scanned the room. She wasn't dressed in the typical formal wear of the other diplomats. Instead, she wore something that looked almost ceremonial, a sleek, black dress that clung to her body, made of a material Nathan couldn't place, something that seemed to ripple like liquid metal in the dim light. Intricate silver adornments decorated her neck and wrists, the metalwork etched with symbols that Nathan didn't recognize. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught his attention. It was the way she carried herself, the effortless confidence in her stride, and the subtle but unmistakable power in her gaze. She was clearly someone important, someone who knew exactly the effect she had on the room. As if sensing his eyes on her, she turned, locking her gaze with his across the sea of people. Nathan felt a jolt run through him, sharp and unexpected, like electricity buzzing beneath his skin. For a moment he froze. Her eyes held his, unwavering, and he could feel the intensity of her focus, even from across the crowded hall. She didn't look away, didn't break the connection, and Nathan found himself rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze from her. The sounds of the room faded, the hum of conversation dulled to a distant murmur as she began to move toward him. Each step she took seemed measured, deliberate, and Nathan's heartbeat quickened. It wasn't fear, though. There was something undeniably intimidating about her presence, but something else. Something primal, instinctual, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Before he knew it, she was standing before him, her eyes still locked onto his. Up close, she was even more striking. Her skin seemed to radiate warmth, the deep red hue contrasting sharply with the cold blue tones of the room. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "You are not like the others," she said, her voice low and smooth, with a faint accent that rolled off her tongue like a melody. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, as if she had already made up her mind about him. Nathan blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. What do you mean?" She smiled, a slow, almost predatory curve of her lips. "You do not belong here. The others. They speak of alliances and power. You observe." He nodded slowly, not entirely sure how to respond. I'm a scientist. I'm here to observe the interactions between our species." Her eyes gleamed with amusement. "And what have you observed so far, scientist?" Nathan swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of how close she was standing. Her presence was magnetic, drawing him in despite every instinct telling him to remain cautious. He cleared his throat. Mostly I've observed that humans are. Uncomfortable, nervous even. The Thraxi your people seem to have that effect on them. She chuckled softly, the sound low and rich. Yes, we tend to have that effect on those who do not understand us. Nathan felt a shiver run down his spine at the way she said it, as if there was something more behind her words, something she wasn't saying. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke carefully. And what about you? Do you feel the same way about humans? She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. I find humans fascinating. Nathan's pulse quickened at her words. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with a tension he couldn't quite place. He was aware of the proximity between their bodies, the faint warmth radiating from her skin, and the way her gaze seemed to pierce through him, seeing far more than he was comfortable revealing. I've heard stories, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, about human skin, that it's soft, delicate. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as she reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his jacket, tracing a line down his arm. Her touch was light, barely there, but it sent a jolt of heat through him. Your skin looks so soft, she murmured, her fingers drifting toward the exposed skin of his wrist. Let me feel it. He wanted to step back, to put some distance between them, but his body refused to move. Her touch was hypnotic, pulling him in, and despite the warning bells ringing in his mind, he found himself unable to resist. Her fingers brushed his skin, and a strange, electric sensation spread through him, leaving his nerves tingling. She looked up at him, her eyes glowing softly in the low light. Do you feel that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded, his throat dry. Yes. Her smile deepened, and for a moment, the intensity of her gaze was overwhelming. Good. She leaned in closer, her lips brushing the edge of his ear as she spoke. Let me taste it. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to step away, to break the spell she seemed to have cast over him, but her voice, her touch made it impossible. He felt like he was drowning, sinking deeper into something he couldn't explain. Before he could respond, she stepped back, her fingers trailing off his skin, leaving a strange emptiness in their wake. She watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning and walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Nathan stood there, his mind racing, his body still buzzing from the encounter. He hadn't realized how tense he'd been until she was gone, the weight of her presence lifting like a fog. He exhaled slowly, trying to regain his composure, but his thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and intrigue. Who was she? And why had she singled him out? The rest of the room seemed to fall back into focus, the hum of conversation returning, but Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something in the air, something between him and her. It was more than just curiosity. There was something deeper, something primal, that pulled at him. He scanned the room, looking for any sign of her, but she had vanished, blending into the sea of faces in formal attire. Nathan's mind buzzed with unanswered questions, but one thing was certain: the night wasn't over, and neither was his encounter with the mysterious Thraxi woman. This was only the beginning. Nathan didn't see her again that night. After their charged encounter, he spent the rest of the evening with his mind spinning, distracted by the memory of her touch. Even as he tried to re-engage with his colleagues or listen to the countless conversations happening around him, he felt detached, like part of him was still back there in that moment, caught in her gaze, ensnared by her words. The event continued late into the night. Delegates from various nations and the Thraxi spoke in hushed tones, exchanging polite nods and handshakes, all while maintaining a careful distance from one another. Nathan moved through it all on autopilot, only half hearing the conversations around him. The room's air felt heavy, suffocating in its political importance. He managed to field a few questions, participate in a shallow exchange of pleasantries with another scientist, but his mind kept drifting back to her. By the time the gathering began to wind down, Nathan was grateful for the chance to leave. The weight of the night pressed down on his shoulders, and all he wanted was a moment to himself to think, to try to understand what had happened, and why he couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from over. The city streets outside were a stark contrast to the opulence of the event hall. Cold, sharp air bit at his skin as he stepped onto the pavement, the lights of the city glowing in the distance. He welcomed the cool air, hoping it might clear his head, though part of him wondered if even that would help. Her presence still lingered in his mind like a faint, intoxicating scent that wouldn't fade. As he walked the short distance to his hotel, Nathan's thoughts spiraled in circles, replaying their encounter over and over. The way she had looked at him like she could see something hidden beneath the surface, something he wasn't even sure existed, had unsettled him. There was an intensity to her gaze, an unspoken promise that left him feeling exposed, vulnerable. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just a passing moment, he told himself. She was curious about humans, maybe testing his reactions. There had to be some logical explanation. Maybe it was just part of the Thraxes' cultural behavior, a way to assert dominance or test boundaries. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the memory of her words echoed in his mind. Let me feel it, taste it, and claim it for myself the way she had said it, like a command wrapped in silk, left him feeling something more than just confusion. It had been primal, undeniably magnetic. Nathan reached his hotel room and sank onto the edge of the bed. The city sounds below honking cars, distant voices melted away into a low hum as he stared blankly at the wall. He tried to focus on the practical. He needed to prepare for tomorrow. There were meetings scheduled, reports to be written, and another summit to attend in the evening. Everything about this trip was calculated and serious, yet all he could think about was her. After a restless night filled with half-formed dreams of glowing eyes and the warmth of a soft, red-skinned touch, Nathan woke the next morning feeling just as unsettled as when he'd fallen asleep. He moved through his morning routine: shower, coffee, skimming through messages, trying to shake off the lingering remnants of his dreams. But that feeling remained, lodged deep in his chest, refusing to let him fully focus. By midday, Nathan found himself back at the embassy, surrounded by the familiar buzz of preparation for another round of diplomatic meetings. He sat through several briefings, nodding along as Earth's delegation discussed strategy, trade agreements, and scientific advancements. Normally he would have been engaged, contributing his expertise, but today his attention kept wandering. As the afternoon wore on, Nathan couldn't stop his thoughts from drifting back to her. He hadn't caught her name the night before, hadn't even asked, and yet her face, her voice, haunted him. He hadn't expected to be so affected by her, by the way her presence had ignited something inside him, something he couldn't quite define. Later that evening, the summit resumed in full swing, much like the night before. Nathan arrived, greeted familiar faces, and made small talk with the same diplomats and scientists, the same formalities, the same underlying tension. But this time, as he scanned the room, he wasn't looking for anything in particular, he was looking for her. For the first hour, she was nowhere to be seen. Nathan's heart sank with each passing moment, though he couldn't explain why. Part of him had hoped that their encounter had meant something, that maybe, just maybe, she had felt that same pull. As the night wore on, he wandered from conversation to conversation, half-heartedly engaging while his eyes continued to scan the room. But she remained absent. After a while, he found himself outside on the embassy's terrace, away from the crowded room and the murmurs of political talk. The cool air helped clear his head, though the dull throb of disappointment still lingered. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the cityscape. The lights below blinked like stars, the soft hum of distant traffic filling the air. He inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs, and tried to let go of the restless energy that had been gnawing at him all day. "You've been searching for me." The voice came from behind him, low and familiar, sending a shiver down his spine. Nathan turned sharply, his heart jumping into his throat. She stood there, framed by the open door leading back inside, the golden light from the ballroom casting a halo around her figure. Her black dress clung to her curves, and her red skin seemed to glow against the night's darkness. Those golden eyes locked onto his, unwavering, and Nathan felt that familiar electric pull ripple through him once again. He started, but the words caught in his throat. He hadn't been prepared for this, for the intensity of her presence to hit him all over again. She stepped forward, her movements fluid, almost predatory, as she crossed the terrace to stand in front of him. There was a faint smile on her lips, a hint of amusement dancing in her eyes, as if she could read every thought running through his mind. "I saw you watching," she continued, her voice a soft murmur, yet laced with something deeper, something that made Nathan's chest tighten. "You were hoping I'd come to you again." Nathan swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. He wanted to deny it, wanted to say that he hadn't been looking for her, but that would have been a lie. Instead, he met her gaze, forcing himself to stand his ground. "I wasn't expecting." This he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. Her smile deepened, a glimmer of satisfaction crossing her face. "No, you weren't." For a long moment, they stood there, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Nathan felt his pulse quicken, his skin prickling with the awareness of how close she was, how her gaze seemed to see straight through him, as though she already knew everything he was thinking. "What do you want from me?" Nathan asked, his voice quieter now, laced with the curiosity and confusion that had been gnawing at him since their first encounter. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as if she were considering her answer. Then, she reached out, her fingers grazing the skin of his wrist, just as she had the night before. The touch was light, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a shockwave of heat through him, igniting that strange electric sensation once more. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and for the first time he realized he didn't have an answer. He had been chasing after something all day, some elusive feeling that he hadn't been able to define, but now that he was standing here, face to face with her, he wasn't sure what he wanted or what he was afraid of. But he couldn't deny the pull anymore. It was magnetic, primal, something deep in his core that responded to her in a way he didn't fully understand. The rational part of him, the scientist, screamed at him to step back, to walk away, to keep his distance from something that felt too intense, too dangerous. But his body was already leaning toward her, drawn in by the invisible thread that seemed to connect them. "I don't know," he whispered, the words spilling from his lips before he could stop them. Her smile softened, and for a moment, her expression shifted, something almost tender flickering in her eyes before it vanished, replaced by the same confident, unreadable gaze. "Then let me show you," she said, her voice smooth as silk. Before Nathan could respond, she stepped even closer, her body just inches from his. Her fingers trailed up his arm, leaving a trail of warmth in their wake, and then without warning, she leaned in, her lips brushing against the edge of his jaw. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath hitching at the sudden, intimate contact. His skin buzzed with sensation, every nerve ending alive with the awareness of her touch, her proximity. He wanted to pull back, to stop this before it went any further, but his body refused to listen. He was frozen, caught between the pull of desire and the fear of what came next. Her lips ghosted over his skin, soft and warm, and he couldn't suppress the shiver that ran through him. She didn't push further, didn't force him, but the invitation was clear in every slow, deliberate movement. She was waiting for him to make the next move, to decide whether he would give in or walk away. Nathan's mind raced, torn between the weight of his responsibilities and the undeniable, visceral need that she had awoken in him. He knew that crossing this line would change everything, that whatever happened between them would be more than just a fleeting moment. There was something deeper at play, something that went beyond simple attraction. He swallowed hard, his pulse racing in his ears, and then, slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head, just enough to meet her gaze. Her eyes were glowing softly in the darkness, watching him with that same intense focus, as if she were waiting for him to make a decision. For a long, suspended moment, Nathan held her gaze, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. And then, before he could second-guess himself, before he could think too hard about what he was doing, he leaned in. Her lips met his in a soft, tentative kiss, and the world seemed to fall away. Every thought, every worry, every bit of uncertainty melted into the background as the sensation of her mouth on his consumed him. She tasted like warmth and spice, like something foreign and familiar all at once, and Nathan couldn't help but lose himself in it. When they finally pulled apart, Nathan was breathless, his skin flushed, his heart still racing in his chest. She smiled at him, her fingers still trailing softly over his skin, and for the first time since their encounter began, Nathan felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. Whatever was happening between them, it was far from over. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling of her touch, even as the cool night air prickled his skin. Ileana had retreated into the shadows, leaving him on the terrace, his pulse still hammering from their last kiss. Her presence still lingered around him like a scent, impossible to ignore. He had barely managed to ground himself in reality again, but the way her fingers had traced over his arm, the words she had whispered stopped thinking. Nathan. Just. Feel had left a mark deeper than he was willing to admit. He stared out at the city skyline, the lights shimmering below like distant stars, trying to find some sense of normalcy in the familiar view. The summit had been exhausting mentally and emotionally. Every conversation inside those walls had felt like a dance around unspoken threats, each word chosen carefully, each glance measured. And now this. This strange magnetic connection with Ileana had thrown him into completely uncharted territory. What was it about her that unsettled him so much? It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was something deeper. She saw through him in a way no one else ever had, peeling back layers of carefully constructed defenses with nothing more than a look. It made him feel exposed, and yet, inexplicably, it drew him in further. It wasn't logical, and that was what disturbed him the most. He had spent his entire life relying on logic, on facts, on evidence to guide his decisions, and here he was, standing on the edge of something he couldn't quantify or understand. The doors to the terrace creaked open behind him, and Nathan turned, expecting to see her again, that familiar intensity in her eyes. But instead, it was Dr. Julian Hart, one of his colleagues from the scientific delegation. Julian was tall, with a lean frame and a sharp, inquisitive face. He had always been more comfortable in a lab than at diplomatic events like these. "Hey," Julian greeted, stepping onto the terrace and giving Nathan a friendly nod. "I figured you'd be out here. You always disappear when these events get too political." Nathan forced a smile, grateful for the distraction. "You know me too well. I needed some air." Julian leaned against the railing beside him, his gaze following Nathan's out over the city. "You and me both. These summits are exhausting, so much posturing, and yet no one's saying what they really mean." "Yeah," Nathan muttered, though his thoughts were elsewhere. There was a beat of silence before Julian spoke again, his voice dropping slightly. "You seemed distracted tonight. Everything okay?" Nathan hesitated. How could he even begin to explain what had happened? The intensity of his encounter with Ileana was something that defied explanation, especially to someone like Julian, who viewed the world through the same rational, scientific lens that Nathan had always relied on. But something in Nathan had shifted, and he wasn't sure if he could keep it hidden any longer. "I met someone," Nathan said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. Julian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Someone?" Nathan exhaled, leaning against the railing and running a hand through his hair. "A Thraxi woman. Her name's Ileana. She's different." Julian frowned, clearly confused. Different how? Nathan struggled for the right words, his mind still tangled in the memory of her touch, the way her eyes seemed to see straight through him. "I don't know how to explain it. There's this connection between us. It's not logical, but I can't ignore it. She just gets me in a way that no one else does." Julian's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and concern crossing his face. "Nathan, you know we're here to observe the Thraxi, right? We're supposed to be studying them, not getting involved with them." "I know," Nathan said quickly, though the words felt hollow. "It's not like that. I didn't plan for any of this. It just happened." Julian sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I'm not judging you. I get it. The Thraxi are fascinating. And yeah, some of them are. Well, let's just say they're easy on the eyes, but you need to be careful. We don't know much about their culture yet. Their norms, their boundaries, it's all new to us." Nathan nodded, though his mind was already spinning. He knew Julian was right. The Thraxi were an enigma, and diving headfirst into something so unknown was dangerous. But there was something about Ileana that felt impossible to resist, like he had already crossed a line and there was no going back. Julian clapped him on the shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. "Just keep your head on straight, okay? We've got a lot riding on these talks. You don't want to get swept up in something that could jeopardize it all." "I'll be careful," Nathan promised, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise he could keep. With that, Julian headed back inside, leaving Nathan alone once again on the terrace. He leaned against the railing, his thoughts racing. He knew Julian was right. He should be cautious, rational, but the pull he felt toward Ileana was anything but rational. It was instinctual, almost primal, and no amount of logical reasoning was going to change that. The next morning, Nathan woke early, the memory of Ileana still lingering at the edges of his mind. He had tried to push her out of his thoughts, to focus on the tasks at hand, but it was no use. She had taken root somewhere deep within him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. The summit meetings that day were long and draining, filled with technical discussions about resource sharing, scientific exchanges, and tentative steps toward future cooperation. Nathan played his part, offering insights when needed, but his mind was elsewhere, always drifting back to the night before. Every now and then he found himself scanning the room, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but she was nowhere to be seen. By the time the evening arrived, Nathan was exhausted. The summit had drained him, both mentally and emotionally, but despite the fatigue weighing on him, he couldn't deny the restless energy that thrummed beneath the surface. He needed to see her again, needed to understand what this pull between them meant. As the day's formal meetings came to a close, Nathan found himself wandering the halls of the embassy, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The building was quiet now, most of the delegates having retired for the night. The dimly lit corridors stretched out before him, and for a moment he considered going back to his room, trying to get some sleep. But then he heard a soft, familiar voice drifting down the hallway, carrying with it the unmistakable tone of amusement. He turned the corner and there she was, standing in the shadows near an open window, her red skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. Ileana. Nathan's heart skipped a beat as their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She didn't seem surprised to see him, as if she had been expecting him all along. Her lips curved into a knowing smile, and she stepped forward, the shadows parting around her as she moved toward him. "You came," she said softly, her voice a low hum that sent a shiver down Nathan's spine. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ileana's smile widened and she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm, just as they had the night before. "Good," she murmured, her touch igniting that same electric sensation in his skin. For a moment Nathan stood there, caught between the urge to pull her closer and the nagging voice of reason that warned him to be careful. But when Ileana looked up at him, her golden eyes shimmering with something he couldn't quite name, that voice of reason faded into the background. She stepped closer, her body just inches from his, and Nathan felt his pulse quicken. There was something intoxicating about the way she moved, the way she held herself with such quiet confidence, as if she already knew exactly how this night would end. "You've been thinking too much again," she teased, her voice a soft whisper in the space between them. Nathan swallowed, his throat dry. "I can't help it." Ileana's eyes sparkled with amusement, and she reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. "That's what I like about you, Nathan. You're so careful, so controlled." Her hand slid down to his chest, resting over his heart, and Nathan felt his breath hitch at the contact. Her touch was warm, almost hot, and it sent a rush of heat through him, igniting something deep within. "But tonight," she whispered, her voice dropping to a low murmur, "you don't need to be careful, you don't need to think." Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as her words wrapped around him like a command, and for a moment he was lost in the feel of her touch, the sound of her voice, the magnetic pull between them that defied all logic. He knew this was dangerous. He knew he should walk away, should put distance between them before he got swept up in something he couldn't control. But as Ileana's lips brushed against his, soft and teasing, all those thoughts faded into the background. And then, without thinking, Nathan closed the distance between them, capturing her mouth in a kiss that was both tentative and hungry. Ileana responded immediately, her hands sliding up his chest, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pulled him deeper into the kiss. The world around them fell away. The sounds of the embassy, the weight of their responsibilities, all of it disappeared, leaving only the two of them, tangled in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. Nathan's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and he felt the warmth of her body against his, the softness of her skin beneath his fingers. It was overwhelming, the intensity of the connection between them, and for the first time in his life, Nathan stopped trying to understand it. He let himself feel, just as she had asked him to. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Ileana smiled up at him, her eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. "See," she whispered. "Isn't this better than thinking?" Nathan chuckled softly, still trying to catch his breath. "You might be right." Ileana's smile deepened, and she reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. "I usually am." For a long moment, they stood there in the quiet hallway, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the open window. Nathan's mind was still spinning, but for once he didn't feel the need to analyze it, to break it down into pieces he could understand. All that mattered was the feel of her in his arms, the warmth of her skin against his, and the unspoken promise of something more. But even as the moment stretched between them, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play, something that went beyond the pull of desire, beyond the physical connection they shared. There was a mystery here, a question that lingered at the edges of his thoughts, and he knew that, sooner or later, he would have to confront it. But for now, with Ileana's hand resting against his chest and her lips just inches from his, Nathan was content to let that mystery remain unanswered. For now, he would simply feel. The next morning, Nathan woke with a weight in his chest, the residue of the previous night clinging to him like the lingering traces of a dream. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face with both hands as he tried to clear the fog in his mind. The sheets beneath him were cool, the room bathed in the faint, early morning light that seeped through the curtains. He blinked, disoriented, for a moment questioning whether any of it had been real. Ileana. The Thraxi woman with glowing golden eyes and skin the color of burning embers. The way her lips had tasted, the soft heat of her breath against his neck, her presence consuming him like a slow burning flame. Nathan's pulse quickened as he remembered the kiss they'd shared, the way his body had responded to her as if it had a will of its own. Even now, with the dawn creeping in and the responsibilities of the summit looming ahead, the memory of her touch had a hold on him. It pulled at something deep inside him, something primal and raw that defied all reason. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. It had been reckless. He knew that. Getting involved with Ileana was not only dangerous, but it threatened to cloud his judgment, something he could not afford in the midst of these delicate negotiations. The summit had been planned for months, years even, and the stakes were higher than ever. Both the Thraxi and human delegations were walking a fine line, balancing diplomacy with the looming tension of their vastly different worlds. Nathan's mind raced as he got dressed, buttoning his shirt with fingers that still trembled slightly. He needed to focus, needed to find a way to push Ileana from his thoughts. But as much as he tried, her presence clung to him, a constant, nagging pull at the back of his mind. As the day wore on, Nathan buried himself in his work, attending meetings, reviewing reports, and doing his best to engage with the discussions around him. The summit had entered its final days, and the pace had quickened. Negotiations were reaching their peak, with agreements being drafted and key decisions being made about future relations between Earth and the Thraxi. Nathan was needed. His expertise in the biological and scientific potential of cooperation between the two species was critical. And yet, despite the gravity of it all, his mind kept drifting back to her. Each time his thoughts wandered to Ileana, he could almost feel her eyes on him, as if she was watching from somewhere unseen, waiting for him to acknowledge the pull that bound them together. He shook the thought away, forcing himself to focus on the tasks at hand. But it was no use. By late afternoon, the weight in his chest had grown unbearable, and he needed to escape the suffocating walls of the embassy. He excused himself from the ongoing discussions, citing exhaustion, though the truth was far more complicated. Stepping out into the fresh air, he breathed deeply, the cool wind tugging at his hair as he walked aimlessly through the city streets. His footsteps carried him far from the embassy, into a quieter part of the city where the towering buildings gave way to tree-lined avenues and cobblestone paths. The distant sounds of traffic and the murmurs of the summit faded into the background, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful here, far removed from the diplomatic turmoil that had dominated his life for the past few days. But even in the quiet, Nathan's mind remained restless. Ileana's presence still haunted him, her voice, her touch, the way she had looked at him with that knowing intensity. It was as if she had unlocked something within him, something he hadn't even realized had been dormant. He stopped at a small park, sitting down on a bench beneath the shade of a large oak tree. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the breeze wash over him, as he tried to make sense of the tangled emotions swirling within him. Lost in thought again. The voice was soft, familiar, and unmistakably hers. Nathan's eyes snapped open, his heart leaping into his throat as he turned to see Ileana standing a few feet away. She was dressed simply in a dark, flowing gown that shimmered faintly in the evening light. Her red skin glowed like fire in the fading sunlight, and her golden eyes watched him with that same unrelenting focus. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed to hum with an energy that Nathan couldn't define, a connection that defied the logic he so often clung to. "Ileana," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. He stood slowly, his body drawn toward her, as if by some unseen force. She smiled, a soft, knowing smile that sent a familiar warmth coursing through him. "You've been avoiding me," she said, though there was no accusation in her tone. It was merely a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet confidence that she always carried with her. "I've been busy," Nathan replied, though the excuse sounded weak even to his own ears. Ileana stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "That's not the real reason," she said softly, her voice like silk, wrapping around him and pulling him in. Nathan swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. She was right, of course. He hadn't been avoiding her. Because of his responsibilities at the summit, he had been avoiding her, because of the way she made him feel. The way she unraveled him, piece by piece, stripping away the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. "I don't know what this is," he admitted finally, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "I don't know what I'm feeling, or why I can't stop thinking about you, but I can't let it distract me from what's important." Ileana tilted her head, her expression softening slightly as she stepped closer, until she was standing just inches from him. Her presence was overwhelming, intoxicating, and despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind, Nathan couldn't help but lean into it. "And what if this is important?" she asked quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What if you're feeling this way because it's meant to be?" Nathan's breath caught in his throat, his mind reeling at her words. It wasn't possible. How could this, whatever it was between them, be anything more than a fleeting moment, a brief collision of two worlds that would soon drift apart? And yet, deep down, a part of him wondered if she was right. "Ileana, But before he could finish, she closed the distance between them, her fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. The touch was soft, almost hesitant, and Nathan felt his heart stutter in his chest as she looked up at him, her golden eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. "You feel it too," she whispered, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "don't you?" Nathan exhaled slowly, his body trembling as he reached up to take her hand in his. The connection between them was undeniable, a magnetic pull that had drawn them together from the moment their eyes had first met. "I do," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I don't understand it, but I do." For a moment they stood there, the world around them falling away as they lost themselves in each other's gaze. Nathan's heart raced, his mind spinning with the weight of the unspoken truth that hung between them. This was more than just attraction. It was something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of their worlds. But even as the moment stretched between them, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered at the edges of his thoughts. This connection, whatever it was dangerous. It threatened to unravel everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to protect. "Ileana," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know if this can work. We come from different worlds. There's too much at stake." Ileana's eyes softened, and she reached up to cup his face in her hands, her touch gentle but firm. "I know," she said softly, "but sometimes the things worth fighting for are the ones that scare us the most." Nathan's heart clenched at her words, the truth of them sinking deep into his chest. He knew she was right. He had spent his entire life avoiding risks, choosing the safe path, the logical path. But now, standing here with Ileana, he realized that some things were too important to ignore. Slowly he leaned down, his forehead resting against hers as he closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her presence wash over him. For the first time in days, the weight in his chest seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of calm he hadn't known he needed. "I don't know what's going to happen," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "but I want to find out." Ileana smiled softly, her breath warm against his skin. "So do I." The hours melted away as they wandered through the quiet streets, talking about everything and nothing at all. Nathan learned more about Ileana, about her life on the Thraxi homeworld, about her people's culture, their beliefs, their hopes for the future. She spoke with a quiet passion, her words painting vivid pictures of a world so different from his own. And yet, despite the vast differences between their worlds, Nathan found himself drawn to her even more. As the night wore on, they found themselves back at the embassy, the towering building looming ahead of them in the dim light. The city had quieted, the streets nearly empty, and for a moment Nathan hesitated, reluctant to return to the reality of the summit. Ileana must have sensed his hesitation, because she turned to him with a soft smile, her golden eyes shimmering in the faint glow of the streetlights. "You're still thinking too much," she teased gently. Nathan chuckled, the tension in his chest easing slightly as he shook his head. "I can't help it." Ileana's smile widened and she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Then let me help you." Before Nathan could respond, she pulled him toward her, her lips meeting his in a soft, tender kiss that sent a shiver down his spine. The world around them seemed to disappear once again, leaving only the two of them, wrapped in the warmth of the moment. When they finally pulled apart, Nathan's heart was pounding, his breath shallow as he looked down at her, a sense of awe washing over him. How had this happened? How had he, a man who had spent his life relying on logic and reason, been drawn into something so inexplicable, so undeniable? "Ileana," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But she silenced him with a finger to his lips, her eyes soft and full of understanding. "I know," she said quietly, "I know." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the night settling over them as they held each other close. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Nathan allowed himself to stop thinking, to stop questioning, and to simply feel. The embassy was silent as Nathan and Ileana stood on the steps, the world around them still and quiet under the night sky. The glow of the city lights in the distance painted their silhouettes in a soft haze, but even in the stillness, the air between them hummed with the intensity of everything that had passed between them. Nathan's hand was still wrapped in Ileana's, the warmth of her skin against his grounding him in the moment. For the past several hours they had wandered the city, talking, laughing, losing themselves in the rare sense of freedom that came from stepping outside the rigid confines of their roles. But now, standing here at the threshold of the embassy, the weight of reality began to settle back over them. The summit loomed ahead, critical decisions were still to be made, and Nathan knew that this connection, this undeniable pull between them, could complicate everything. But as Ileana turned to look up at him, her golden eyes soft and warm, all of his carefully constructed walls began to crumble. "I should go inside," he said softly, though his voice lacked conviction. Ileana raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Do you want to?" Nathan hesitated. He knew what he should want: to return to the safety of his room, to prepare for the final rounds of the summit, to bury himself in his work and keep his distance from this beautiful, complicated alien woman. But his heart was no longer in line with his mind. Every time he was near her, every moment they shared, he felt something shift inside him, something that defied logic and reason. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to." Ileana's smile widened, and she stepped closer, her fingers tightening around his. "Then don't." The invitation hung in the air between them, tantalizing and dangerous. Nathan could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, urging him to make a choice. He knew that if he followed her, if he allowed himself to dive headfirst into whatever this was between them, there would be no turning back. But the thought of turning away now, after everything they had shared, felt impossible. Slowly Nathan nodded, the decision made without words. Ileana's smile deepened, and she gently tugged on his hand, leading him down the steps and away from the embassy, away from the responsibilities that awaited him inside. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps echoing softly against the quiet streets. The city seemed almost otherworldly at this hour, the usual bustle of life replaced by a serene calm that felt like it existed just for them. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tightrope between two worlds: his world of structure and logic, and hers, full of mystery and instinct. "Where are we going?" he asked eventually, breaking the silence as they turned down a narrow street, the buildings looming tall and dark around them. Ileana glanced over at him, her eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. "Somewhere quiet," she said simply, her voice soft but sure. "Somewhere we can be ourselves." Nathan's pulse quickened at her words. There was something thrilling about the idea of leaving behind the constraints of their roles, of allowing themselves to exist outside of the summit, outside of the rules that had been placed upon them. But there was also a flicker of doubt in the back of his mind, a reminder of the risks they were taking, of the consequences that could follow. "Ileana," he began, his voice hesitant, Are we sure about this? I mean, everything is so fragile right now, the summit, the negotiations. If anyone finds out about us. Ileana stopped walking, turning to face him with a seriousness that hadn't been there before. Nathan, she said softly, her fingers brushing against his cheek, I know what's at stake. I haven't forgotten why I'm here. But I also know that some things are worth the risk. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Nathan swallowed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life playing it safe, following the rules, making decisions based on logic and reason. But standing here with Ileana, the rules felt distant, irrelevant. All he wanted was her. He exhaled slowly, his hand finding hers once again. You're right, he whispered. I just don't want to ruin this. Ileana smiled, her eyes softening. You won't, we won't. With that, she led him further into the quiet streets, the city fading into the background as they ventured deeper into the night. Nathan wasn't sure how long they walked, but eventually they reached a small, secluded courtyard tucked between two tall buildings. It was quiet, with a single bench nestled beneath a large, sprawling tree. The soft rustle of leaves filled the air, and a gentle breeze brushed against Nathan's skin, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and flowers. Ileana sat down on the bench, her movements graceful and fluid, and Nathan followed, sitting beside her. For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of the world lifting ever so slightly as the night wrapped around them like a protective cocoon. This is nice, Nathan said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. It feels safe here. Ileana nodded, her golden eyes gazing out at the courtyard. I come here sometimes when I need to think. It reminds me of home. Nathan turned to look at her, his heart swelling at the vulnerability in her voice. She rarely spoke about her home, about the Thraxi world she had left behind to come to Earth for the summit. And as much as he wanted to know more, he had always sensed that there were parts of her life she wasn't ready to share. But tonight, sitting here in the quiet, he felt a shift, a softening, an openness. What's it like, he asked gently. Your home. Ileana was silent for a moment, her gaze distant, as if she were looking beyond the courtyard, beyond the city, to someplace far away. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, filled with a quiet longing. It's beautiful, she said slowly. Our world is wild and untamed, full of life and color. There are forests that stretch for miles, their trees so tall they touch the sky. The air is thick with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh rain. And at night the stars shine so brightly you can almost touch them. Nathan closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. He could picture it, the vibrant colors, the vast, open landscapes, the wild beauty that must have shaped her into the woman she was. A part of him longed to see it, to experience the world that had given birth to such a fierce, passionate soul. But it's also dangerous, Ileana continued, her voice growing quieter. Our people are always on the edge of survival. The planet is harsh, the weather unpredictable. We've had to learn to adapt, to rely on our instincts. That's why. We don't always think the way humans do. We act, we feel, we survive. Nathan opened his eyes, his heart aching at the weight of her words. He had always known the Thraxi were different, that their way of life was shaped by forces far beyond anything he had experienced. But hearing it from Ileana, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, made it all so much more real. You must miss it, he said softly, reaching out to take her hand in his. Ileana smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. I do, but I also know that being here on Earth is important. Our people need allies, need to find a way to coexist with humans if we're going to survive. That's why this summit is so critical. Nathan nodded, his mind returning to the negotiations, to the fragile peace that had been brokered between their worlds. He understood the weight of it all, the responsibility that had been placed on both their shoulders. And yet, sitting here with her, in the quiet of the night, all of those responsibilities felt far away. I think about that a lot, Nathan admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. The future, I mean. How our two worlds are going to come together, how we're going to navigate all the differences between us. It's overwhelming. Ileana squeezed his hand gently, her golden eyes softening as she looked up at him. It is, she agreed. But I believe we'll find a way. There's more that connects us than we realize. Nathan smiled, though a flicker of doubt still lingered at the edges of his mind. I hope you're right. For a long moment they sat in silence, the soft rustling of leaves filling the air. Nathan's mind wandered, thinking about the summit, about the delicate balance they were trying to maintain. There was so much at stake, so many unknowns. And yet, despite the uncertainty, he couldn't shake the feeling that being here with Ileana, allowing himself to explore whatever this was between them, was the right thing to do. Ileana turned to him then, her expression serious but tender. "Nathan," she began, her voice steady, "I know this is complicated. I know there's a lot we don't understand about each other's worlds, but I want you to know that. I trust you. I trust us." Nathan's heart clenched at her words, the sincerity in her voice cutting through the doubt that had been gnawing at him. He looked into her eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope, and something inside him shifted. "I trust you too," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Together." Ileana smiled, her eyes shimmering with something Nathan couldn't quite name. "Together," she echoed softly. They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the moment settling over them like a blanket. The night stretched on, but neither of them felt the need to leave. For the first time in days, Nathan felt a sense of peace, a calmness that settled deep in his bones. As the hours passed, the city around them slowly began to stir, the sounds of early morning traffic filtering into the quiet courtyard. Nathan glanced at Ileana, who had leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closed in peaceful contentment. "I think it's time," he said softly, though he wished they could stay here forever, suspended in this quiet, perfect moment. Ileana opened her eyes, a soft smile on her lips. Yes, she agreed, though there was a hint of reluctance in her voice. "We have work to do." Nathan nodded, though his heart was heavy. The summit awaited them, along with all the complexities and challenges that came with it. But for the first time since the negotiations had begun, he felt ready. Ready to face whatever lay ahead, with Ileana by his side. As they stood, preparing to leave the quiet sanctuary of the courtyard, Nathan took one last look around, letting the peace of the place settle deep within him. And then, with a deep breath, he turned to Ileana, his hand finding hers once again. "Let's go," he said softly. Together they walked back toward the embassy, the weight of the world waiting for them. But Nathan knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was all he needed.